Hello everyone. Today we're discussing a rather controversial case from the USA. Opinions on this matter might be divided. Sandra and Jon lived in Texas and worked at the same company. Sandra was 13 years older than Jon, but this age difference didn't bother them at all. Sandra had already been through a failed marriage and was the mother of 2 children. Her son's name was Wes, and her daughter was Andrea. The couple dated for a few years before deciding to get married. Their wedding took place on January 1, 2000, in Las Vegas. From that moment, they officially started their life as a family. This was when Jon became not only Sandra's husband but also took on the role of a father. Jon was known to be a very warm and caring person. Most people liked him and got along well with him. However, those who had issues with him often pointed out his tendency to drink excessively. According to friends and family, Jon's behavior could become quite unpredictable during those times, possibly leading to uncontrolled anger or irritation. Alternatively, he might become overly sociable and talkative, which could be exhausting for those around him. At one point, Jon faced serious mental health challenges and was on medication during that difficult period. He worked as a manager at a packaging company, responsible for hiring and firing employees. He generally enjoyed his job and had no major complaints about his family life or marriage. Sandra and Jon were very much in love, feeling phenomenal in each other's company and considering themselves soulmates. There were no significant issues between Jon and Sandra's children. When a parent starts a new relationship, it can often lead to a lack of acceptance or rebellion, but this was not the case for their family. Although Jon was officially their stepfather in everyday life, he became like a second father, especially to Sandra's son, with whom he quickly formed a strong bond. Andrea, however, was a bit more skeptical and took longer to warm up to her mother's new husband. Her initial apprehension was normal and understandable, but over time, Jon's actions earned her full acceptance and trust. The year 2014 was particularly challenging for the family when Sandra was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a very serious illness. Jon supported his wife every step of the way, doing everything he could to make her feel as comfortable as possible. He took on more responsibilities to help with daily tasks and ensured she didn't feel overwhelmed. This situation solidified Sandra's appreciation for Jon, realizing he was the perfect partner for her. As the family grew closer, Jon managed his work and family life well. However, Sandra's illness began to severely affect her both physically and mentally. The medication she needed to take made her feel very unwell, often leading to depression. In her darkest moments, which unfortunately became more frequent, Sandra contemplated ending her life. She felt like a burden to Jon and suffered greatly from these thoughts. She even searched online for ways to carry out her plans. Sandra worried about how Jon would cope without her. Eventually, she gathered the courage to tell him about her suicidal thoughts and her plan. When Jon heard this, he tried to convince her that this was not the solution. He reassured her that she was not a burden to him, and that he had committed to being with her in both health and sickness. He added that if she were to go through with it, he would do the same. This moment jolted Sandra awake, realizing she could not put her husband or children through such pain. For some people, finding purpose comes through travel, work, or family. Sandra chose family because her husband became her reason to live. Jon became her full-time caregiver, and she quit her job due to her health. Jon became the sole breadwinner, leading to financial pressure that also impacted their relationship. Sandra felt guilty for not contributing financially, but Jon remained positive and supportive, helping her through the challenges. Jon's unwavering support and love made Sandra emotionally, physically, and financially dependent on him, which didn't bother him at all. On the contrary, her illness seemed to strengthen his feelings for her and their relationship. Eventually, the couple decided to move to a town 3 miles outside Dallas. They bought a house and settled there permanently, quickly forming new friendships with their neighbors. Their neighbor across the street often hosted events such as family gatherings, birthdays, and dinners, frequently inviting Sandra and Jon. The couple also reciprocated by hosting gatherings in their home and garden. Over the years, despite Sandra's illness, their life was filled with happiness. The strong foundation of Sandra and Jon's marriage proved to be resilient and unwavering. On Monday, January 1, 2018, Sandra and Jon went to bed around 9:30 to 10 p.m. 2 hours later, the police received a very disturbing call. The content of the call indicated that the caller urgently needed help. In response to the question about what happened, the explanation was given that at the place from which the woman was calling, a man was present who had forbidden her from calling the police. When asked if she knew where the man went, she answered that she didn't because she was in bed at the time. He had threatened her and said he would come back. It turned out that the caller was Sandra. She was clearly terrified and was shouting that her husband might still be alive. She called 911 fearing for her own life.
What is your emergency?
I need somebody to come. I need a police. I need an ambulance. My husband's been shot.
Okay, what happened there?
There was a man here. And he shot him. And he told me not to call the police.
And do you know where the male subject went?
No, I was in the bathroom. And he told me to sit down and count to 100 and not to call the police until I got to 100. He said if I called y'all before he reached 100, he'd come back and kill me. Please hurry. I think he's still alive. He's making noises. Please. What can I do for him?
You want to try to do CPR?
Yes. Yes.
I need to lay him flat on his back on the ground and remove any pillows.
On the ground? You want me to get him off the bed?
Yes, ma'am, if possible. We need to try to do some compression.
Okay. Okay. He's on the floor.
1, 2, 3, 4.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Did they be here?
They're on the way, ma'am.
The police arrived at the given address only after 15 minutes. The officers entered the house. Sandra was in the bedroom, screaming for help. Jon was lying on the floor. The officers checked if Jon was still alive. When Sandra asked if her husband was breathing, she heard that unfortunately he was not. Considering that the man Sandra mentioned might still be in the house, the police decided to search the house and the entire property but ultimately found no one. Once they deemed it safe, they decided to secure the scene. Unfortunately, before they could do so, several paramedics entered the house. This sometimes happens because the mission of saving human lives is the most important, even at the cost of destroying evidence and creating new ones, which can unnecessarily prolong the work of investigators. Sometimes this simply cannot be avoided. Sandra was deeply affected by the entire situation. She was shaken, upset, and couldn't calm down even for a moment. It was impossible to talk to her at that time, which in this situation was completely understandable. Additional services with much more experienced officers arrived at the scene. The truth was that the town where Sandra and her husband lived was very quiet, and such crimes rarely, if ever, occurred, so the support was entirely justified. After the additional officers arrived, they searched the house for evidence. Samples were taken, and the scene of the tragedy was secured. In the meantime, Sandra gave her statement. The investigators asked her to recount her memories of that tragic night, since she was the only witness. Her words could be crucial for solving the case. The interview started around 2 in the morning. Sandra was very shaken, and although she tried to stay calm, it was a very difficult task. She knew that the more nervous she got, the harder it would be for her to focus and provide accurate information. She was very depressed and distraught. In addition to being asked to recount what had happened in the hours leading up to the tragedy, she was also tested for gunshot residue, particularly on her hands. Several photos were taken of her, and the clothes she had been wearing before the interview and at the time of the attack on her husband as described by her were taken. Sandra described what had happened in detail and didn't seem to be trying to hide anything. She was convincing. She said that in the evening her son came over for dinner and she and her husband were at home. Between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. she went to bed and fell asleep without any problem. She was woken by the sound of gunshots 2, maybe 3 hours later. After a moment she added that she believed there were 2 shots. When she woke up she saw a strange man in their bedroom. He was holding a flashlight and a gun. She said she couldn't remember what happened next. Her next memory was of lying on the floor next to the bed. She had been hiding and screaming, desperately wanting someone to hear her and help her. When asked about the attire and specific features of the attacker, she described him as a white-skinned man wearing a blue hoodie and jeans. His face was covered by a mask. She also remembered that he was taller than her. That was all Sandra could say about his appearance. According to her recollection, the man's main target was Jon, and what happened was a form of revenge. Sandra said the man claimed Jon had fired him from his job, so she assumed he must have been one of Jon's former employees. He also said he had heard that Jon kept money at home, which was why he came there. Sandra said she knew they kept all their savings in the safe. At one point, she dared to look at the attacker. In the light from the safe's lock, she could see his eyes, though his entire face was covered by the mask. The man noticed this immediately and told her that if she looked at him again, she would be killed.
You make an entry to the backyard. Back door's open. Dog. Big dog.
Police!
Sheriff's office?
Yes!
Sheriff's office?
Where you at, the bedroom?
Please help me.
119. Send EMS down. We'll have the front door open.
What's his name?
His name is John.
John what? Here. You got your light. All right, we'll start here. Okay, and then some shots going up. And there's no blood droplets or anything that looks of significance. I want to get a shot from this angle right here. That's the door he supposedly came out of. Nothing on the door itself.
Nothing is disturbed back here at all.
No, Okay. I'm going to go ahead and start taking some pictures here. We got a crime scene unit coming, and the JP's been notified. Could I get you to stand right there? Can you turn around for me, please?
Plans for some friends, a couple that would.
Put your hand out like that. Okay, and I'm going to put it out like this. Okay, all right.
Sandra said she thought there could be around $18,000 in the safe, but since she hadn't checked in a long time and hadn't counted the money, her words couldn't be verified. After the attacker took the money, he led Sandra to the bathroom, where he made her count to 100. Only after that could she call the emergency number. She was questioned for many hours but was eventually allowed to return home. When she got there, her whole family was already waiting for her at her in-law's house, which was across from her home. Everyone wanted to show her support, mourn John, and discuss what had happened that terrible night. They tried to understand what had occurred. Sandra was more upset than ever before. Most of the family did not suspect that Sandra could have anything to do with it. They assumed she had faced a tremendous tragedy. However, some had many doubts about the matter. Sandra returned to her home for the night. She didn't want to stay at her in-law's house, even though it might have seemed terrifying to stay at her own house knowing what had happened there. She said she would be comfortable there and had no intention of moving anywhere else. Moreover, she hoped the attacker would return so she could deal with him herself. After meeting with her family, Sandra went to rest, and the family informed her son that John, unfortunately, was dead. As soon as he heard, he went there. The officers talked to him. He hadn't spoken with his mother earlier, which could be surprising in this situation. The woman had been present when someone took her husband's life, threatened, robbed, and interrogated for many hours. She had gone through a lot that night, but despite this, her son decided to speak with the officers first. During the interrogation, he mentioned that he had suspicions about his mother. During the conversation, he clearly suggested that his mother might be responsible for John's death. This questioning was very difficult since it was his mother. However, he stated that he didn't believe the version of events his mother had created. In his opinion, there was no attacker. The story was invented to deflect blame from herself. He believed his mother wanted to clear herself of any suspicion. His reasoning was that John often kept weapons in various places in the house, sometimes in unexpected locations, as if in a crisis he could reach for them without hesitation. Maybe he really feared someone. Maybe someone had threatened him. Or perhaps he had a conflict, apart from the fired employees. Although how many people would attack a manager after being fired is another matter. One of the guns found turned out to be a gift from John for their anniversary. During the search of the house, a bullet was found in one of the pillows in John and Sandra's bedroom. Everything that could be significant was secured, including electronics, phones, and internet search data. Importantly, during the interrogation and testing of Sandra's hands for gunshot residue, a small amount of residue was found. This was explained as possibly resulting from contact with Jon's body during resuscitation, since she had tried to save him following the dispatcher's instructions when reporting the shooting. Although many traces at the scene were destroyed and photos from the scene were ultimately lost, what remained in this case worked against Sandra. With additional findings, her son's testimony, and traces on her hands, the version that Sandra might have been involved became increasingly plausible. Additionally, in her browsing history, an article was found describing ways to avoid being caught after committing a serious crime, such as taking someone's life. The history also included searches about various medications. Although there were normal, everyday topics like how to make cappuccino in a coffee machine, the overall situation didn't look good for Sandra. By January 4, 2018, suspicions about Sandra had intensified, but there wasn't enough evidence, especially since the weapon used in the crime hadn't been found. The police remembered her son's words about her keeping a gun under the car seat. They decided to check that place again. The first time, they found nothing there. The next day, the police decided to search again. Sandra was at her in-law's house at the time. Everyone present was surprised that she became very upset. Until then, she had cooperated willingly. This time, she felt these actions were meant to prove something against her. She wanted the police to search for the real perpetrator and leave her alone. She tried to prevent them from searching the garage, but the police stated they didn't need her permission to enter. It would take more time, cause more damage, but they would still check the places they were most interested in. Analyzing the situation and calming down a bit, Sandra finally handed over the keys, leading them inside and checking the place indicated by Sandra's son. It turned out that a gun was found in the Mustang, which could have been the murder weapon. This still needed to be confirmed. The gun was lying under the seat, wrapped in paper towels. The police knew they couldn't have missed it during the initial search. Someone must have planted it there later. Sandra was questioned again, this time not as a witness but as the main suspect. The police immediately made it clear to her that they considered her guilty and accused her of lying and trying to mislead the investigators. Sandra was very stressed at that point, claiming she was telling the truth and simply did not do it. Since the interrogation recordings were leaked to the media, the case became one of the most closely followed. Many people also had their own observations about her demeanor. Some people claimed that Sandra was a great actress and was indeed guilty, while others believed she was genuinely distraught. The police examined the gun found in the car, but no fingerprints or DNA were secured on it. However, it was determined that Jon had been shot with a .38 caliber weapon. Due to these findings, along with an increasing amount of evidence against Sandra, it was decided to arrest her. She was very surprised by this fact, likely not expecting such a turn of events. The arrest was witnessed by the family living across the street. For some time, Jon's family had been convinced of Sandra's guilt. They couldn't contain their satisfaction and cheered, feeling that justice was finally being served. Sandra was taken to jail with bail set at $2 million, an amount far beyond her financial means, so she had to remain there for the duration of the investigation. The police continued their efforts to determine exactly what had happened. Sandra was charged with taking her husband's life. Being sent to jail and accused of such cruel acts affected her both physically and mentally. She changed beyond recognition. The situation had sapped her will to live. In September 2019, her trial began. Sandra looked very exhausted and almost neglected. Despite her appearance suggesting otherwise, she stated she was certain she could participate in all of it, wanting to defend herself and believing there wasn't enough evidence to convict her. A key piece of evidence was the gun found in her car, but the lack of fingerprints or DNA complicated things. The further the investigators delved into the details, the more they realized there was a real chance of Sandra being acquitted. As more details emerged, new possibilities and potential suspects appeared. One major aspect of the case was the behavior of Sandra's son. Why was he so certain that his mother was guilty? Why was he so determined to convey his convictions to the police and wanted the officers to believe him? At one point, he was considered a suspect. The deeper the investigators looked into the case, the more things started to make sense. He had access to Sandra's phone and iPad and often stayed at her house. Interestingly, a few days before the tragedy, when certain searches were conducted on Sandra's devices, he was at her house and had full access to all the devices secured by the police. Moreover, just before the gun was found in Sandra's car, even though it wasn't found during the first search, There was a suspicion that Wes might have planted it there. It all looked like a setup against Sandra. Could her son have tried to frame her? During the preparations for the trial and at its beginning, it was assumed he had a solid alibi at the time of the tragedy. He was logged into his Netflix account. This was accepted without much scrutiny because theoretically everything matched. However, it turned out that these events took place in a different time zone, which significantly undermined his alibi and cast doubt on where he actually was at the time. Many mistakes were made in this case, and many other issues were simply overlooked. It was established that he might have had a motive involving complications related to the will. Nonetheless, these issues significantly undermined Sandra's culpability. Questions about her motive also remained unanswered. What would her reason be? Jon was an integral part of her life, caring for her every day, and at some point he became someone she decided to live for. During the trial, the inexperience of the officers and procedural errors were also discussed. It took the police 15 minutes to arrive at the scene, which didn't look good. The officer working that night was participating in an investigation into such a serious crime for the first time. The crime scene wasn't secured properly, which could have affected the evidence. A crucial point was the incorrect procedure for examining the traces on Sandra's hands the same night her husband lost his life. Additionally, the evidence was improperly secured, and some were lost. In court, the prosecution tried to emphasize that no burglar would engage in a long conversation with Sandra, explaining the details of his presence and the reasons for what he eventually did. The prosecutors also dismissed the theory that Wes could be the perpetrator, arguing that his characteristics, behavior, and other aspects did not match the profile of the person they were looking for. They also raised the issue that there was no logical explanation why Sandra wouldn't recognize her own son that night if he were the attacker. Indeed, she only saw his eyes briefly. Recognizing her son in such stressful circumstances seemed very difficult. It was hard for her to understand a scenario where someone completely unfamiliar would enter her home and shoot. She was so scared and confused that she couldn't think logically. Towards the end of the trial, she stated that it was Wes who was the perpetrator. This allowed for a confrontation with the opposing side, which aimed to undermine her defense. This was not an easy moment for Sandra. She couldn't recall many details, including those concerning the searches of her house, property, and car. This definitely undermined her credibility in the eyes of the jury. However, when it was time for the defense, the lawyers pointed out to everyone that many issues remained unclear. Since many mistakes had been made, many questions could never be resolved. Due to the enormous amount of material that needed to be analyzed, lengthy jury deliberations were expected. Surprisingly, they concluded after just a few hours. At 5 p.m., everyone, including Jon's family, gathered in the courtroom to hear the verdict. She was acquitted. Sandra hugged her lawyers and expressed immense gratitude for regaining her freedom after spending 21 months in prison. She and her family, especially her daughter Andrea, were very happy. The exception was Wes and Jon's family, who had hoped for a different verdict. They were very disappointed with the verdict. Sandra returned home with good memories, saying she wanted to be close to Jon and that the place brought her closer to him. The situation was not easy because Jon's parents lived across from Sandra and most likely to this day, despite the court's verdict, believed that she escaped responsibility. Reportedly, after some time they moved to another city. Sandra's family maintained contact with her, but she wanted nothing to do with her son. Furthermore, she believed that he was the one who took her beloved husband's life. However, there was no evidence to support this claim. Sandra was acquitted, and no charges were brought against Wes. Concerns about Sandra's safety arose, but she didn't want to change her place of residence, believing that despite the many adversities and mistakes in her husband's case, the truth would eventually come out. As often happens in such cases, there were many speculations. Some believed Sandra was guilty but had managed to get acquitted, while others thought that it was Wes who took Jon's life and tried to shift all the responsibility onto his mother, as if wanting to distance her from himself. However, due to many oversights, lack of experience, and most likely the lack of validity in this claim, no charges were brought against him. Some speculated about a conspiracy, but after Sandra's release from prison, they broke off all contact with each other. What do you think about all of this? Is someone mentioned responsible for this tragedy, or should the perpetrator be sought elsewhere entirely? I'm waiting for your comments on this matter. In the meantime, that's all for this episode.